Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, Secretary Sajid Javid.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to update the House on the Government's response to the Grenfell Tower tragedy and our safety inspections of cladding in other buildings. Almost 3 weeks have passed since the catastrophe that hit Grenfell Tower. Progress has been made to help the survivors and people in the surrounding buildings who were affected. Landlords across the country have been taking measures to make their buildings safe. Sir Martin Moore-Bick has been appointed to lead a full public inquiry, and an independent expert panel is now advising my department on any immediate action on fire safety that is required. Mr. Speaker, the disaster at Grenfell Tower should never have happened. The police investigation and public inquiry will find out why it did. Right now, the immediate priority of the government is to provide every assistance to those who were affected and to take every precaution to avoid another tragedy in buildings with similar cladding. The Grenfell Tower Victims Unit is operating from my department and providing a single point of access into government. Staff from across government continue to offer support at the Westway Assistance Centre and a separate family bereavement centre. Almost £2.5 million has been distributed from the £5 million Grenfell Tower Residents Discretionary Fund. Each household affected is receiving £5,500 to provide immediate assistance, and so far payments to 112 households have been made. Mr. Speaker, there has been much speculation about who was in Grenfell Tower on the night of the fire, and it's vital that we find out. As I announced yesterday, the Director of Public Prosecutions has made it clear that there will be no prosecution of tenants at Grenfell Tower and Grenfell Walk who may have been illegally subletting their property. So all tenants can be confident about coming forward with information for the authorities. There may have been people living in flats that were illegally sublet who had no idea about the true status of their tenancy. Their families want to know if they perished in the fire. These are their sons, their daughters, their brothers, their sisters. They need closure, and it's the least that they deserve. But that can't happen unless we have the information we need, so we are urging anyone with that information to come forward and to do so as quickly as they can. Mr. Speaker, the immediate response to the Grenfell disaster is being coordinated by the Grenfell response team led by John Barradell. He is being supported by colleagues drawn from London councils, the wider local government sector, the voluntary sector, police, health and fire services, as well as central government. Their expertise and hard work is making a huge difference, but this is only a temporary measure. It is also vital that we put in place long-term support for the longer-term recovery. It was right that the leader of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea took the decision to move on. I look forward to working with the new leader of the council, and I will look at every option to ensure that everyone affected by this tragedy has the long-term support they need. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister promised that every family who lost their home because of the fire would be offered a good quality temporary home within 3 weeks, and the deadline is this Wednesday. I've been monitoring the progress of rehousing, and we will honour that commitment. Every home offered will be appropriate and of good quality. What we will not do is compel anyone to accept an offer of temporary accommodation that they do not want. Some families have indicated that they wanted to remain as close as possible to their former home, but when they received their offer, took a look at the property, they've decided it would be easier to deal with their bereavement if they moved further away. Some families have decided that for the same reasons they would prefer to remain in hotels for the time being. Other households have indicated that they would prefer to wait until permanent accommodation becomes available. Every household will receive an offer of temporary accommodation by this Wednesday, but every household will also be given the space to make this transition at their own pace and in a way that helps them recover from this tragedy. Mr. Speaker, the people affected by the disaster at Grenfell Tower need our assistance, and they are receiving it, but they also want answers. Sir Martin Moore-Bick has been appointed to lead a full public inquiry. He has visited Kensington, he has met with victims and survivors, as well as members of the local community who have done so much to help. After consulting with the community, Sir Martin will then advise on the terms of the inquiry, and we will ensure there is legal support for victims so that they can play their full part. We must allow that inquiry and the criminal investigation to run their course. Each must have the space to follow the evidence wherever it takes them. We must all be careful not to prejudge or prejudice either of them. But what we can do right now is take sensible precautions to avoid another tragedy. The Building Research Establishment is continuing to test the combustibility of cladding from councils and housing associations, as well as private landlords. So far, all the samples of cladding testing have failed. That's 181 out of 181. It's obviously disturbing that there are such large number of buildings with combustible cladding, and the priority now is to make those buildings safe. Where appropriate mitigating measures cannot be implemented quickly, landlords must provide alternative accommodation while the remedial work is carried out, and that is exactly what happened in the 4 tower blocks in Camden. Our primary concern has been buildings over 18 metres or 6 stories where people stay at night. Hospitals and schools are also being assessed. Mr. Speaker, we ourselves have asked questions about the testing regime after discovering the 100% failure rate so far. Last week, I asked for the test process itself to be independently reviewed. This was done so by the Research Institutes of Sweden, and they have confirmed they believe the process to be sound. A full explanatory briefing note on the testing process has been made available on gov.uk. As the note explains, every failed test means that the panels are unlikely to be compliant with the limited combustibility requirement of the building regulations guidance. This has been confirmed by legal advice and the advice of the independent expert panel which was established last week. For use of the panels to be safe, landlords need to be confident that the whole wall system has been tested and shown to be safe. We are not aware of any such system having passed the necessary tests, but I have asked the expert advisory panel to look into this further. Mr. Speaker, almost 3 weeks have passed since the catastrophe that hit Grenfell Tower, and I know I speak for every member of this House when I say we are still all in shock. It's not just the terrible scale of the suffering, it was that it happened in 21st century Britain, in London's richest borough. I will continue to direct the full resources of my department to assist the Grenfell response team. I will be working closely with the new leader of Kensington and Chelsea Council to make sure there are plans in place for a longer-term recovery, and I will return to this House regularly to update honourable members on progress. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
John Healey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Secretary of State for the prior copy of his statement. He struck an appropriate tone today. These are complex challenges for government, both national and local. But ministers have been off the pace at every stage since this terrible fire. Too slow to grasp the scale of the problems people are facing, and too slow to act. For the Grenfell Tower survivors, for the victims' families, and for the local community in North Kensington, underlying everything is the question of trust. That those in positions of power mean what they say, do what they promise, and don't drag their feet before acting to deal with the problems. And that's a powerful message that must be understood by ministers, Kensington and Chelsea Council, and the Chair of the Public Inquiry, Sir Martin Moore-Bick. Now, the Grenfell Tower residents understood, Mr. Speaker, what the Prime Minister meant when she said, "I have fixed a deadline for everyone affected to be found a new home within 3 weeks nearby." It is 3 weeks on Wednesday since the fire. How many people are still in hotels? The Secretary of State gave the latest version of the government's promise today, a good quality temporary home within 3 weeks. Does this include hotel rooms? How temporary is temporary? And by what date will all residents affected by the fire be in permanent new homes? And while we're trying to get the numbers clear, how many survivors are there from the Grenfell Tower? How many have not received the government's immediate assistance payments of £5,500? Now, turning to the wider fears, Mr. Speaker, of those living in 4,000 other tower blocks around our country. The government says 600 tower blocks with cladding need safety checks, but nearly 3 weeks on, the Secretary of State confirms today only 181 have been tested so far and all have failed. So will he accept these tests are too slow and too narrow? Will he confirm the government is only testing one component of the cladding, not the panels, the adhesives, the insulation, not the cladding as a composite system, nor the installation method or the impact on the buildings? All can affect fire safety qualities. And importantly, will the Secretary of State confirm that cladding is not the whole story? We know this, Mr. Speaker, from the 2 coroner's reports after the previous fires at Shirley Towers and Lacanel House 4 years ago. So will he act now, not wait for the public inquiry, to reassure residents in all other tower blocks by starting the overhaul of building regulations, retrofitting sprinkler systems, starting with the highest risk blocks, and making very clear the government will fund up front the full costs of any necessary remedial works? Now, turning to the public inquiry the Secretary of State mentioned, the Prime Minister has rightly set up this inquiry to get to the bottom of what went wrong at Grenfell Tower and help make sure this can never happen again. She said no stone will be left unturned. Yet Sir Martin Moore-Bick has said, I've been asked to undertake this inquiry on the basis that it would be pretty well limited to the problems surrounding the start of the fire and its rapid development. So I say to the Secretary of State, I recognise the importance of the independence of the inquiry, but will he make clear to the House today what brief Sir Martin has been given by the Prime Minister for this inquiry? And as the Secretary of State said, John Barradell is leading the Strategic Coordination Group at present, providing the emergency response, relief and leadership that Kensington and Chelsea Council itself failed to do after the fire. How long will they be running these operations? What is the hand-back plan, and who will they hand back to? Mr. Speaker, there are deeper flaws in this council beyond the very serious failings in the response to the Grenfell Tower tragedy. And every public statement from the ruling politicians confirms they're in denial. These are exactly the deeper problems that commissioners and a full corporate governance inspection would help put right. The government is still off the pace. If this council were a school, it would be in special measures. Fresh leadership would be needed, fresh confidence would be built and must be built in this council. Mr. Speaker, actions speak louder than words, and actions count most in helping the Grenfell Tower survivors and in rebuilding their confidence in the future, and also rebuilding the wider public trust that must be there for the residents who live in our tower blocks and make those their homes right across the country.
The Secretary of State, Communities and Local Government, Secretary Sajid Javid.
Thank you. First, can I thank the right honourable gentleman for his comments. He asked a number of questions. Let me start with the first, around temporary housing. Our commitment has been very clear and unchanged from day one, is that all residents of Grenfell Tower and Grenfell Walk will be offered temporary accommodation in Kensington, Chelsea or neighbouring borough within 3 weeks. And as I've just explained in my statement, what that offer means is precisely that. I want to make sure they have high-quality accommodation offered them that's appropriate for their family type and their family size, but they will not be forced and should not be forced to accept accommodation that they do not want to move into at this point. I was down at Westway Centre again on Saturday, and my honourable friend, the Housing Minister, was there on Sunday. I met with many of the residents again on that day and talked to many about their needs, and I wanted to listen to them, because when officials have come back to me and said that we're finding that a lot of them, for example, are saying, I'd rather stay in hotels for now and perhaps then exercise an opportunity to move into some of the permanent accommodation that has already been identified, especially the 68 units at Kensington Row, then that is something we should take into account. It will be absolutely wrong for us to say, no, you can't stay in the hotels, you have to move, and then you're going to have to move again. So we should be led by them. I've met residents also that have said, I thought I wanted something close to where I lived before. When I went there, despite the property being very high quality and appropriate in many ways, when they looked out the window, they saw the tower, and clearly they were reminded of things that they would rather not be, and they've changed their mind. Again, and I'm sure the Right Honourable Gentleman is not saying this, I'm sure he's not saying that we should force families in that circumstance to accept it no matter what. We will be led by the families and by their needs. So our commitment is clear that come Wednesday, every single family, every household that has come forward to us so far, that is from Grenfell Tower and Grenfell Walk, would have been offered high-quality temporary accommodation. The Honourable Gentleman, Right Honourable Gentleman, also asked about, does that mean hotels? So hotels are emergency accommodation, temporary accommodation, and I went to see some examples of this myself in a neighbouring borough on Saturday as well, is high-quality temporary accommodation. It may be houses, it may be flats, whatever is the choice of the resident. And then there's permanent social housing. To identify the permanent social housing, especially if it's in the borough, if that's the desire of the family, it will take more time. As I've said, as well known, that we've identified 68 units already. There are a number of other units that we are very close to adding to that availability. But again, that will be the permanent housing that we'll be able to offer those families and let them decide if that's something that they feel is appropriate for them. The Right Honourable Gentleman also asked about the testing process. The testing process can only move as fast as the samples that come in. Now, since I gave my last statement, there's been a very sharp pickup in the number of samples coming in from the local authorities and from housing associations, and we are turning those around within hours of those coming in, with the results going immediately to the landlord. The Right Honourable Gentleman asked about the test itself and how it works. It is testing a component of the each of the cladding panels. It is testing the core of each of those panels. It's taking a sample of that core, then categorising it in terms of limited combustibility as either category 3, 2 or 1, with category 3 and 2 being deemed as not meeting the buildings regulation guidance. The Right Honourable Gentleman also asked about whether it's testing the whole system. So, as I said, it's testing the core of the panel. It is possible that there can be whole system tests. That is not the test that's been currently conducted by BRE, but the expert panel is now advising, they're meeting again today, to advise how that can be done appropriately so that we can convince that whole system test actually works and leads to a positive result. But so far, as I said in my statement, we have yet to see any evidence from any builder where they have shown that they have passed this whole system test. The Right Honourable Gentleman also asked about funding. Again, we have made it very clear that whatever measures that need to be taken, any remedial measures to make buildings safe, local authorities, housing associations should get on with those. And for those local authorities or housing associations that need help with funding, we are ready to discuss that with them and we will work with them. The Right Honourable Gentleman also asked about the public inquiry, and he's rightly pointed out, remind the whole House again, it is independent. We have to be very careful what we say about it in this House or elsewhere, but let's just remember that Sir Martin, he started immediately, he started meeting, as he rightly should, with victims and volunteers and others, and he will set out the terms of the inquiry, and he is not there yet. He should take the right amount of time that is necessary and make sure the inquiry is very broad and it's to the satisfaction of the victims and their families and friends, and that they feel that the terms of reference are appropriate. And lastly, the Right Honourable Gentleman asked about Kensington and Chelsea. Clearly, the response team at the moment, the Grenfell response team that is being led by what's been referred to before as the Gold Team by John Barradell, and it has been led appropriately with tremendous resource both from the local government sector and voluntary sector and from central government. At some point, the process of recovery for the longer term will transfer to the Council. We're not at that point yet. And at that point, we need to make sure the Council is properly resourced with expertise as well as money and any other help that it needs for that. And we'll make sure when that happens, it is properly resourced.
Chris Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend confirm that he's working with devolved governments to ensure that every tower block around the country are going through the same fire safety tests?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I can confirm that to my honourable friend. So far, the Welsh Government have identified 13 tower blocks with ACM, and they are all being tested.
Kirsty Blackman.
Thank you very much. I thank the Secretary of State for coming to the House to make the statement on the Grenfell Tower tragedy, and I do appreciate the chance to have advanced sight of the statement. That was very useful. I also welcome the announcement about the 112 households that have so far received payments. I'm not clear if the Minister said this already, but I would appreciate knowing how many have still to receive payment and the timescale for those payments, how long they're likely to take. Mr Speaker, I, along with many of this House, have been approached by residents in my constituency who live in multi-storey blocks. I'd like to commend the work that local authorities have been doing in terms of taking action to test buildings and also taking action to reassure tenants that live in those buildings. I used to live in a local authority multi-storey, and I well understand the access issues that people are concerned about, and I appreciate the moves that have been made by a number of organisations working together in order to provide reassurance. I would again restate the position of the SNP that the public inquiry should be as wide-ranging as possible, and that at every stage of that the Grenfell Tower survivors' views should be taken into account. I would also ask a couple of things. I'd ask for reassurance that residents that are being helped as far as possible in replacing lost documentation that they may have lost in the fire, and also ask about those residents whose families might want to take part in the inquiry who live abroad, and about the financial help that is available for them in order to ensure that they can come to the inquiry and to take an active part in that. Lastly, I would welcome the confirmation that there will be no prosecution of the tenants, and I think it's really important that those tenants and anyone who's been living in there does come forward, and I welcome the government's views around that.
Hear, hear.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for her comments? First of all, in terms of payments so far, this is payments from the discretionary fund. So there's £5 million available from that fund. £2.44 million has been paid out so far. Of the grants, of the £500 cash payments, that's 249 have been made. That's 124,500, and there have been 112 payments of the £5,000 grant. I also should point out and remind for people that are listening that that has no impact on benefits or any other compensation that individuals might receive. I agree with her absolutely on the comments you made about the public inquiry. It should be as wide-ranging as possible and absolutely should have the inputs of victims, their families and friends, and those victims must get the legal support that they need to make proper and full representations. In terms of lost documentation, I can confirm starting soon after the tragedy from the Westway Centre especially, but also from the Victim Support Unit here in my department, Westminster, there's been almost every government department necessary that's been represented there. In fact, one fantastic example I saw of that on Saturday was when I met the team from DVLA from Swansea, and what they had done when they turned up at the Westway Centre within just a few days, a couple of days of disaster happening, they'd already when they arrived, they printed out driving licenses, brought them with them. So as residents were turning up and saying, I need a driving license, fully expecting to make an application, they were actually handed it to them in an envelope once an ID check was done. So that's the extent many government departments have gone to, and that's what we expect as we continue to help these people with the recovery, these victims. Thank you.
Shelbrooke.
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend has described the test taking place in housing association, local authority housing, schools, hospitals. What conversations has my right honourable friend had with the insurance industry in regard to totally private tower blocks? Leads us in much regeneration, lots of tall tower buildings with cladding. It would strike me that insurance companies have a vested interest in making sure that these blocks are also dealt with before new regulations may come into place.
My honourable friend is right to point that out. I know that the insurance industry has been taking great interest in the work that's happening, especially with regard to testing. And my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, had a meeting with the insurance industry just last week.
Mr. David Lammy.
The Secretary of State will be aware that the statement from the new independent chair that the scope of the inquiry might be limited to the start of the fire and how it spread has caused some alarm amongst survivors. Can he say a little bit more about that? And can he also confirm that all survivors will get proper legal aid to get proper independent solicitors and barristers representing their interests?
Yes, I can confirm that to the honourable gentleman. When I was there again on Saturday, I think which soon followed the first visit made by Sir Martin, a number of survivors and their families also made that point to me. So I do think it's worth reiterating and making clear that the inquiry, whilst the judge will rightly sort of determine that ultimately for himself, that we all expect it to be broad, as wide-ranging as possible, and absolutely we want to make sure that all the victims, the survivors, their families and friends feel that they are properly represented and get the proper financial support to give.
Bridgen.
My right honourable friend has sadly informed the House that so far 100%, all 181 samples taken from buildings have failed the combustion tests. Without wishing to prejudice the public inquiry or any future criminal action, would my right honourable friend tell the House whether there is one origination source for this cladding, or if it's multiple sources, which then hints at a more systemic failure across the industry?
I can tell my honourable friend it's multiple sources.
Order. The honourable gentleman, the member for Norwich South, is a most estimable fellow, but I think he's probably still enjoying his honeymoon. And we hope that he did celebrate his honeymoon with great joy. But I just gently point out to him that he beetled into the chamber 17 minutes after the statement started, and therefore it's a trifle saucy to expect to be called on this occasion. We will store him up. We will store him up for another occasion on which he can give the benefit to the House of his wisdom. Karen Buck.
A week ago, the Secretary of State told us that the government was capable of processing 100 tests a day. So we now know there is a backlog of 419 tower blocks that have not yet been tested. Could the Secretary of State tell us where the backlog is? How many samples are currently in the laboratory? How many have failed to be provided across the country? And what he is doing to ensure that they are all supplied?
First of all, I can tell the Honourable Lady there's no backlog, because we can only process the tests as soon as the samples come in. And when they do come in, they are processed literally within hours, and the landlord is informed along with the local fire and rescue service. I can also update the House on the numbers. The original estimate, this was before we had received back the information from the local authorities and housing associations, was there could be up to around 600 buildings that were similarly clad, owned by them. We now think it's around 530.
Mr. Robert Courts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I commend the Secretary of State for the speed of cladding testing that he's referred to just now. Could he tell the House, please, where there are interim recommendations made, what processes are in place to ensure that landlords actually comply with and carry them out?
Well, I can tell my friend what we've done in the immediate term, where there is a piece of cladding fails the test. We've made sure that the landlord in that case is informed immediately. The local fire and rescue service themselves will carry out the fire safety check, and we expect all those recommendations to be followed. But I think with the involvement of the local fire and rescue service and the fact that they will report back to my department, we are able to monitor progress.
Fitzpatrick.
Mr. Speaker, I don't think the Secretary of State made reference to the review of building regulations and the fire guidance contained in approved document B, which officers of the all-party group had the opportunity to raise with his honourable friend the Minister, and we're grateful for that opportunity. This review was recommended by the Coroner's Inquiry from Lakenal House, and it's 11 years since the last review. Can he tell us, has the independent panel of experts the power or the authority to recommend a recall of the Building Regulations Advisory Committee Working Party on approved document B, so that this work can begin now rather than wait till the end of the public inquiry?
Mr. Speaker, I think the Honourable Gentleman makes a very important point about building regulations and building regulations guidance as well. I mean, clearly, it's already clear to us all that there will need to be changes, that we do need to look very carefully at what are the causes, the fact that so many buildings are failing the guidance test. The expert panel it has a wide remit, and it is broadly to recommend to government immediately any action that they think we should be taking that will improve public safety. But more longer term, we will set out in due course how we intend to tackle the much wider review that I think is going to be necessary.
Whiteford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Some media outlets have suggested that Grenfell survivors have been forced to move to cities in the north of England. Can the Secretary of State reassure this House that nobody who chooses to not move out of London will be deemed intentionally homeless?
I can. First of all, I can tell my honourable friend that I too have heard these kinds of rumours, and yet no one has come forward with any evidence of any such thing taking place about someone being asked to be moved outside London. And I can also give my honourable friend reassurance on the intentionally homeless point. In fact, I wrote to every resident last week on Thursday to make that point very clear to them.
Swinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The safety of domestic appliances is a vital element of fire safety in tower blocks and indeed in all homes. This horrendous fire started with a fault in a fridge. So will the Government revisit their decision of March last year to dismiss or delay many of the recommendations of the Lynn Falls Wood Review into product recall, which I commissioned in 2014? And in particular, will the Secretary of State recognise that the funding for enforcement of safety regulations through trading standards is inadequate and urgently must be addressed?
Mr. Speaker, I can tell the honourable member, first of all, I know that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Business, is looking at this issue very seriously. He's a member of the task force that has been discussing this and many other issues, and I know he's speaking to many manufacturers about what can be done to make sure that when products are recalled, that it is done much more quickly and much more safely.
Andrew Slaughter.
I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, but I find the sophistry of the Secretary of State today quite sickening. The reason that people are refusing offers of accommodation is because they're not suitable, sometimes by reason of age or disability, not because they're fussy people. And the units of social housing being offered are existing social housing. So what happens to the people who would have gone into those? We're going to have a net reduction in the amount of social housing. It's an open secret in West London that the administration in Kensington and Chelsea couldn't run a bath. That's why the residents of North Ken have had such a raw deal for so long. So when will he put country before party and send in the commissioners?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is a local London MP, and he has an opportunity now to put party politics aside and just do the right thing for his constituents. His constituents are watching him.
John Pursglove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Friday afternoon, I met with both the Chief Executive and leader of Corby Borough Council, and they assured me that all of the requests that the department has made have been complied with by the local authority, and I shall ask the same questions of East Northamptonshire Council this Friday. However, is there anything more that individual members can do to support ministers and government working across party lines and with local authorities in the review processes ahead?
Mr. Speaker, I can tell my honourable friend that I think one role that many individual members, including himself, have been playing well is making sure that their own constituents are well informed about what the testing process is and what the results actually mean. And that's one of the reasons we published the explanatory note on Friday last week. And I know that many members have taken that note and used it to inform their own constituents.
Clive Betts.
Can I come back to the issue of commissioners, which the Mayor of London, amongst others, has asked to be put into Kensington and Chelsea. And of course, they needn't be put in to manage the whole of the council, but could be put in just to manage their social housing responsibilities. As a localist, I do believe commissioners should only be put in extremis, such as Rotherham or Tower Hamlets. But surely this is an extreme example of a failure of governance. Will the Secretary of State therefore say what consideration is given to this request, what factors he's taken into account, and if he does reject it, does that mean he has full confidence in Kensington and Chelsea's ability to manage their social housing stock?
Mr. Speaker, what the honourable gentleman rightly highlights is that when the control of the recovery effort transfers to Kensington and Chelsea for the longer term, we do need to make sure that the right resources are there. That includes the right expertise and good leadership. Now, that isn't about to happen. Before that happens, the government will rightly consider all options that will bring that about.
Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Minister describes having a broad and wide-ranging public inquiry, and yet Sir Martin describes having been given a very narrow remit. Can the Minister explain this conflict and how he will clarify? Because this has to get us the answers in the end.
Good question.
Mr. Speaker, what I can tell the Honourable Lady, and she will know, as an independent inquiry, rightly so, that it is important that the judge ultimately sets the terms of reference. But it is just the beginning of the process, and I would just urge her and all honourable members to give the judge time to speak to victims, their supporters, the families, volunteers, and others, and then come to the final judgment on how wide the terms of reference should be.
Alex Berghart.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. And this terrible disaster obviously raises questions about the effectiveness of local emergency planning. I was wondering what steps are being taken here and elsewhere to ensure that other local authorities have good emergency responses should other disasters befall them.
Mr. Speaker, I think one of the lessons already from this tragedy is trying to make sure that across the country that we take a fresh look at planning for civil emergencies, and that work has already begun, being led by the Cabinet Office.
Jess Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Based on the intelligence of survivors, it appears that a number of the flats were severely overcrowded, and we have to assume that those flats were being sublet illegally and inhabited by people with unstable immigration status, and possibly even those who've been trafficked, which has been identified as a problem in the borough of Kensington and Chelsea. What are the ministers doing to ensure that private landlords, legal or otherwise, are properly declaring vulnerable people who were in the building on the night of the fire and not potentially profiteering from any properties or finances being offered to survivors?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady, one of the steps that we have taken to recognise that this picture, which absolutely may well have been happening where there was illegal subletting, was the announcement that was made yesterday by the Director of Public Prosecutions, which is to say that we want everyone with any piece of information to come forward, and that's why this guarantee that they will not be prosecuted was offered, and I think that will help and make a big difference.
Thangham Debonair.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've been visiting tower blocks across my constituency with fire officers and housing officers over the last few weeks, and residents remain very, very concerned and frankly do not understand why the government and successive ministers appear to them to have ignored the recommendations of the Lakenhall House Fire Coroner's report on sprinklers. And I would suggest that ministers shaking their heads of opposite try visiting my constituency, standing on the 15th floor and explaining it in person to those residents why there are no sprinklers.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I think it's good that the Honourable Lady has been visiting tower blocks in Bristol. I hope that she's been able to reassure some of her constituents. I think having MPs' involvement is good. But she is wrong on the recommendation of sprinklers from the coroner's report due to Lakenhall House. Those recommendations were implemented fully.
Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given what the Grenfell fire has exposed about the combustibility of external cladding in the UK, can the Minister confirm whether appropriate tests are being conducted at non-high-rise buildings as well as high-rise buildings?
Our priority has been buildings that are taller than 18 metres, that's typically 6 stories, more than 6 stories, and also residential, because that's where you would expect the highest risk, because naturally people would be there overnight. But that is the starting point, that is the priority, and we do expect that after we've dealt with the priority cases that we can make the testing facility available for all other types of buildings.
Paula Sheriff.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Secretary of State will recognise that many other public buildings, including hospitals, have as part of their accommodation tower blocks, which may have the vulnerable cladding upon them. Can he therefore confirm how many hospitals have been tested so far, and out of that number, how many have failed those tests?
Good question.
Interesting question. Interesting. What I can confirm, Mr. Speaker, is that indeed, as I mentioned in my statement, hospitals and schools and other buildings in the public sector are being looked at. It's work that's being led through the Government Property Unit by the Cabinet Office, and that process of testing is going on. What's already happened, even before the cladding can be tested, we've made sure in such cases that the local fire and rescue service has been informed and that any mitigating measures that are necessary are being taken.
Clive Efford.
Speaker, the Secretary of State has said that the testing of the core of the cladding has led to 181 failures, but he also said that that meant that the local authorities had breached building control. Is that building control at the time that the cladding was put up, or is that a building control regulation as it stands today?
I can tell the Honourable, the last time there was a change, any significant change in building regulations guidance was in 2006. Much of this cladding took place in the early 2000s. It was put up at that time. So there's been no significant change in building regulations or building regulations guidance pertaining to fire safety for a number of years. When I mentioned in my statement that they failed the limited combustibility test, it's that same test that's been around for a number of years.
Diana Johnson.
Take the Secretary of State back to hospitals, because my local hospital is a tower block with cladding that was put on in the last few years. And the Hull Royal Infirmary management team have been very reluctant to tell the public about what additional checks have been undertaken. They, after being pressed by the local BBC several times, they've now admitted that the cladding has been sent off for testing. But isn't it about time we had a statement from the Secretary of State for Health, so we can be clear about all our hospitals and other buildings that have got cladding on, so the public know what's happening?
Mr. Speaker, I can assure the Honourable Lady that this has been taken very seriously. Where ACM cladding or suspected ACM cladding has been found for any hospital, whether it's a tall building or not, that cladding has been submitted for testing. But even before the results of those tests are back, those local health trusts have taken action, put in place mitigating action. So, for example, many of them have put in place full-time wardens, fire wardens, 24 hours a day to make sure that they are providing maximum public safety.
Louise Elman.
The lessons of Hillsborough are that survivors must be listened to at all times, that the inquiries must be transparent and must be comprehensive. What assurances can the Minister give in relation to Grenfell Towers?
I agree wholeheartedly with the Honourable Lady. Those are very important lessons to learn. And I am confident that the Judge, Sir Martin, will represent that as he approaches his inquiry, and I think first public sign we'll see that when he sets his terms of reference.
Kate Green.
Tenants in high-rise blocks in my constituency are often disabled, elderly, or in some cases have poor or no English. Can the government start to work now with local authorities and housing providers to develop effective strategies to protect those most vulnerable tenants in the event of a fire or other disaster?
Mr. Speaker, there are already many rules and regulations in place to do just that, but I do think it's important, in terms of all the lessons that we are learning from this terrible tragedy, is that we make sure that we're doing everything we can to protect the most vulnerable.
Chris Elmore.
I understand the Secretary of State and his department's focus on the cladding, but can I question him on the installation? There has been some reports to say the installation caught fire was combustible 3 times quicker than the cladding. Industry experts say that we should be looking at a system of non-combustible installation, which is available on the market. So can I ask what he's doing to investigate the safety of installation, also when buildings are actually uncladded and the installation is exposed to the elements?
Mr. Speaker, what the Honourable Gentleman highlights is in the police report on the Grenfell Tower tragedy itself also rightly referred to the installation. What's happened since then is the guidance that we have given to local authorities and housing associations was immediately publicly updated to say that there should be checks on installation too.
Thank you.